land of the Iroquois Confederacy of 5 and later 6 nations imposed a formidable Native American counterpoint to the infiltration of the first waves of industrious newcomers from Europe. These foreigners steadily turned Manhattan, Long Island, New Jersey, and even parts of Connecticut and Rhode Island into one of the most important hubs of the United States' early commercial establishments. North of Albany, however, the Adirondack Mountains remained for a long time on the fringes of activity, even forgotten during the trading and settling frenzy further south and east. Mostly the French crept into the mountainous north, and some mostly ill-fated Jesuit priest forays attempted to convert the generally antagonistic Iroquois tribal groups that had loosely combined to trade or wage war. The French had much more rapport with the Algonquin contestants of the Iroquois chiefs and warriors. Iroquois engagements eventually had major consequences upstate and across the Northeast in general, even to the Ohio country. Political implications probably nudged Iroquois sentiment to favor the British loyalists fighting during the U.S. Revolution against England. I previously presented an extensive pictorial introduction to the upstate New York regions in an appendix attached to Chapter 1. The images here are an additional tour of the Adirondacks, the Black River Tug Hill region squeezed between the Adirondacks and New York's share of the St. Lawrence River, the Lake Ontario, Niagara Falls drain basin for the greater Great Lakes interior, and the southern tier of New York's Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Mohawk, and Oneida hunting grounds. New York State's Northern Territory, the Adirondack Mountains, was and still is a kind of treasured wilderness preserved, one for some settlers and romantics who savor bygone eras, two for a few visiting Native Americans seeking inspiration from their woodland ancestors, and three for sports people challenging their natural talents for endurance and competition. Oh, and nature's irritants, such as mosquitoes and black flies, wage stealth warfare on intruders during the summer until ice and snow bind or blind travelers for many long, darkened months of winter. The people of the Longhouse, a label for the indigenous Iroquois Indian tribes, or Haudenosaunee, ranged across the region and maintained a kind of sovereignty until the end of the colonial Revolutionary War. Their history remains shrouded in an oral cloud of repeated tales, but interactions with Dutch, French, and eventually British traders, trappers, settlers, and military created a rather potent cultural dynamic that eventually melted into the colonial mainstream. My earlier account of this region is replete with intense imagery. This recount is merely a further filling in of some pictorial gaps, featuring additional perspectives of a wilderness region that retains at least some of its original mystique and isolation from the bustle of downstate cities. It is also nostalgic since it is the vicinity of my own home and upbringing alongside the confluence of the Beaver and Black Rivers. The mountains here are on the state's border with Canada and Vermont. The high peaks, or modestly high compared to the mountains of the western U.S., are partially shielded by the Tug Hill Plateau from part of the moisture-laden winds crossing Lake Ontario. The hill collects prodigious amounts of rain and snow in the respective seasons. Tug Hill represents even today rather pure wilderness that is only partially penetrated by homesteaders and woodsmen. It is a cold and snowy wonderland most winters. Relatively cheap farmland sprouted on the Tug Hill's bulk. Hence, farming there can still be profitable, even attracting a small contingent of bargain-hunting Amish land developers. Large wind turbine power stations today harvest the abundant air turbulence in this area, while the landowners harvest hay and shovel cow manure underneath. I exaggerate a little about the shovelers because modern tech has transformed some of the small farm businesses into mega manure factories. Down below this hill is mostly the Black River Valley Basin, containing a network of smaller rivers like the Oswegatchie and Beaver, streams and brooks and rocky hills that enfold a remarkably productive farmland that is often submerged in snowmelt floods in the springtime. Fort de la Présentation was founded in 1749 at the mouth of this relatively small river that originates in the Adirondack Mountains. The village of Ogdensburg, a fur trading post at the confluence with the St. Lawrence River, purportedly counted nearly 3,000 Onondaga living in the vicinity by the Revolutionary War. Most converted to Catholicism. They came to be known as the Oswegatchie Indians. The Adirondacks aren't far away, and southeast is the Mohawk River Valley. The Iroquois generally guarded this frontier. The Oneida were designated gatekeepers. According to the Peacemaker story, toward the end of the 16th century, Hiawatha, an Onondaga in mourning, joined the itinerant peacemaker, Decanawida, in pursuing a unity among the Iroquois. The resulting confederacy, whose governing Great Council of Peace Chiefs, or sachems, made up the leadership of 6 Indian nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. The interaction between northeastern Indians and established foreign settlers in general during the 19th century was a complex and evolving one. What follows in my narrative are some observations made off the cuff, mostly by French travelers Alex de Tocqueville and his friend Gustave de Beaumont in 1831. Even about 50 years after the U.S. War of Independence, the eastern U.S. was being rapidly transformed into a semblance of Western civilization, and many Native Americans already had faded into the western forests beyond the Great Lakes. I choose the letters and comments of these two prolific writers during the early 1800s because of their later notoriety in American literary and political circles, and for their youthful and still untested honesty. From Tocqueville to his mother.
We left Albany in what they call a stagecoach. These are carriages with suspensions made entirely of leather, which proceed at a good clip along roads as dreadful as those of Lower Brittany. Within a few miles your bones are shattered, but we did not think to complain, as we were entirely absorbed by the amazing sights that greeted our eyes. It was our first trip inland. Inland, everything is different in America. About the Indians. The whole territory that we just crossed was once occupied by the famous Iroquois Confederation, which caused such a stir in the world. We encountered the last of them on our route. They begged for handouts and were as inoffensive as their fathers had been fearsome.
Tocqueville and his friend Beaumont were heading for Michigan via Buffalo and Lake Erie. Later, Tocqueville changed his tune. He wrote,
"It would be a mistake, however, to judge the Indian race by this unrepresentative sample, this stray offshoot of a tree of this forest that had somehow taken root in the muck of our towns. But this was the mistake we made ourselves, as we did not realize until later in our journey."
Tocqueville again. In his journey to Oneida Lake, which is one terminal on the Erie Canal partway between Albany and Buffalo.
Soon we found ourselves shielded from the sun's rays in the midst of one of those profound forests of the New World, whose somber and savage majesty grips the imagination and fills the soul with a sort of religious terror. Across a swampy terrain, where 1,000 streams not yet imprisoned by the hand of man run far as the eye can see, nature with incredible profusion has scattered seeds of nearly all the plants that creep over the earth or rise above it. An immense confusion beckoned the eye from afar, a sort of chaos.
From Tocqueville's 2 Weeks in the Wilderness.
One man told us, quote, "Here the Iroquois held the great council of the Confederation." "And what has become of the Indians?" I asked. "The Indians?" Our host went on. "I'm not sure where they went, somewhere out beyond the Great Lakes. They're a dying race. They're not made for civilization. It kills them."
So there you have it, an unvarnished perception of settled foreign residents of New York's smaller upstate communities in the mid-1800s. Hold on. By contrast, I found in Tocqueville's travel notes a conversation with some Canadians, quote, doing business with Indians, unquote, on the banks of the Mackinac. Question from Tocqueville.
Do you think that Indians become better or worse from contact with Europeans? Answer. I think they are much better when they don't have contact with us, and they're certainly happier. You'll find better order and government among them as you move further into the wilderness. I make an exception, though. For Christian Indians, and especially for Catholics, they're the best of all. Question. Don't the Indians realize that sooner or later their race will be wiped out by ours? Answer. They worry incredibly little about the future. The tribes that are already half destroyed, in whose footsteps we march, are desperately aware of the Europeans' westward progress, but resistance is no longer possible. The tribes that live further west, who I've heard number more than 3 million, apparently have no inkling of the danger that awaits them.
Tocqueville wrote that he only collected quotes that corresponded with his earlier impressions. In conclusion here, I stress that human nature poses a tendency to warfare and suppression among all of nature's participants. Native tribes attacked one another apparently on a regular basis before the foreign pioneers disembarked on the shores of North America. Iroquois warriors fought Algonquin-speaking tribal groups like the Hurons and vice versa. The Europeans then joined the mix of social maneuvering and miscalculations. Everybody, in other words, scalped everybody else when paranoia, distrust, and aggression proceeded forthwith. The same dynamic that confronted American citizens, natives, and slaves on the eastern frontier carried over eventually to the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, and Pacific Coast. Spanish, French, and British influences infiltrated the politics, the commercial undertakings, and life across the country. The heart of the Adirondack Mountains, a range visible from Tug Hill eastward across the Black River Valley, still is a mecca for sports and campers, serviced by the villages of Saranac Lake and Lake Placid. 2 international Winter Olympics graced the narrow roadways of Lake Placid in the last century, that investment remaining a major draw to continuing winter sport training operations and summer entertainment too. Whiteface Mountain's skyward slopes nearby are a visual feast in any season. The surrounding forests and multitudes of lakes are the coup de grace, especially as the fall seasonal transformations smother the insects and sink the daily weather temperatures into the nippy range. Northern New York can get really cold in the winter months.